August 19, 1942. Thick jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company wrote in his diary, capturing the disbelief many Japanese soldiers felt when they first met American troops in battle. Under a roof of palms and choking vines, Imi and 916 men from Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment had just come ashore from destroyers under cover of darkness. A landing Tokyo believed would start the recapture of Henderson Field. They had been assured the Americans numbered maybe 2,000, soft, poorly trained, and quick to scare. Colonel Ichiki waved off warnings to wait for more men. "They are Americans," he told his officers. "We'll throw them into the sea before sunrise." None of these veterans of China and Southeast Asia imagined what they were about to face. It would not simply be defeat, something unimaginable to soldiers who had known almost nothing but victory since 1937, but the dismantling of their assumptions, tactics, strategy, and even the ideology behind their way of war. The jungle itself would be turned into an American weapon. The night, long an ally of Japanese forces, would betray them. Superior American gear, tight coordination, and sheer destructive power would break the legend of Japanese dominance at close range. The change had begun 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergrift's Leathernecks were carrying out Operation Watchtower, the first U.S. offensive of the Pacific War. On paper, the task looked simple: capture the nearly finished Japanese airfield, build a perimeter, and hold until relieved. In practice, they were about to fight the longest, harshest campaign in Marine Corps history to that date, an ordeal that would push human endurance to the edge. Guadalcanal was a tropical nightmare. The island runs roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its spine a mountain chain reaching toward constant clouds. The coastal plain where the airstrip lay was a band of kunai grass, swamp, and jungle so dense that visibility shrank to a few feet. Heat pressed down like a weight, with humidity near constant at over 90%. Mosquito clouds were so thick men breathed them in. Rivers that looked clean in aerial photos were alive with parasites. Malaria, dengue, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would sideline more men than gunfire. Yet that first day, the Marines found the airfield almost deserted. About 2,200 construction workers and 600 naval troops scattered into the jungle, leaving behind tools, stores, and, most importantly, the airstrip itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already extending the runway. It would be named Henderson Field, for Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first planes landed, and the island became home to the force history would call the Cactus Air Force. Japan answered quickly, and with disastrous consequences for the U.S. Navy. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a destroyer in a superb surprise strike. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in U.S. naval history. 4 heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra, went down in under an hour, and over 1,000 sailors died in burning water. The remaining Allied ships pulled back, taking with them most supplies still offshore. The Marines were left isolated, facing a growing enemy with roughly half the gear and rations they were supposed to have. What Japanese planners did not see in early August was that Henderson Field had become the center of gravity. Control of that strip meant daylight control of the surrounding sea. Aircraft flying from Henderson could hit any Japanese ship within about 200 miles. That one fact would shape the entire campaign. Japan could dominate the night, rushing in men and stores by destroyer on fast Tokyo Express runs. But at dawn, American planes owned the sky. Tokyo concluded Henderson had to be retaken at once before the Marines dug in too deeply. Imperial General Headquarters handed the job to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army at Rabaul. His available ground strength was thin. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was still in the Philippines. The nearest formation was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, recently stationed near Guam, and originally slated for the Midway invasion before that disaster. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, an infantry school instructor with a reputation for sharp tactics, was also impulsive and unwavering in his faith that fighting spirit could beat American material. Before leaving truck for Guadalcanal, he received explicit orders to wait for the rest of his regiment before striking the airfield. But Ichiki had little respect for American soldiers. Reports from China and the Philippines convinced him Western troops folded under pressure. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers dropped 970 men from his first echelon at Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the U.S. lines. The landing went smoothly and undetected. Ichiki then sent patrols to size up the enemy, a routine move that would prove fatal. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coast toward Coley Point when they saw Japanese troops. A short, vicious firefight followed. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and seized documents revealing a significant enemy force nearby. More crucially, the papers showed the Japanese had badly underestimated American strength. Captain Brush hurried back with the intelligence haul. General Vandegrift grasped what was coming, a near-term attack, likely from the east. He told Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tenaru River. It was actually the Ilu River, but the mistaken name stuck in the histories. Cates placed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the banks, with machine guns covering the sandbar in overlapping fields of fire. What followed would become one of the most lopsided Marine victories on record. Instead of waiting for reports from his lost patrol or his remaining troops, Ichiki chose to attack at once. Through the night of August 2021, he ordered a frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine prized moral force and aggressive night attacks to smash through firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could punch a hole via audacity and close in fighting with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped Japanese captors after hours of torture, staggered into Marine lines to warn them the Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the charge hit. Hundreds of soldiers rushed the sandbar, shouting, firing, and throwing grenades straight into a carefully prepared kill zone. The Browning M1907 and OL1 water-cooled heavy machine guns began their work. Perfected in World War I, they were the unsung backbone of Marine firepower, able to sustain roughly 600 rounds per minute as long as the water jacket stayed topped up. The Marines had sighted them to overlap, leaving no part of the sandbar uncovered. Men fell in heaps under the heavy .30 caliber bullets. Those who made it across met 37 mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister, giant shotgun blasts that tore body and bone to rags. The onslaught continued for hours. Wave after wave charged into the storm of bullets. Some reached the Marine lines, and hand-to-hand fighting flared, rifles, knives, fists, anything at hand. But the defenses held. The overlapping fires stopped every attempt to break through. By dawn, Ichiki's attack had ground to a halt. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying in the shallows and on the bar. Daylight brought no relief. Vandegrift ordered a counterstroke by elements of 1-1 Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled over the sandbar and methodically hunted survivors hiding in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched from Marine lines. The tanks bustled among the trees, pivoting and spitting sheets of yellow flame. He wrote that they had not realized how many enemies remained until group after group was flushed and cut down by canister. By midday on August 20, the Battle of the Tenaru was finished. Of the 917 who landed at Taivu Point, about 800 were dead. Roughly 128, mostly support troops left near the beach, slipped back into the jungle and radioed 17th Army with the disaster. Colonel Ichiki was among the dead, though accounts differ. The official version claimed he burned the colors and committed ritual suicide. Others said he fell in a last charge. Marine losses were around 40 killed and wounded. The psychological shock to surviving Japanese troops was immense. Captured papers and later testimonies show the same realization. A regiment had been wiped out in one night. The Americans hadn't reacted as Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic in darkness or break under screaming charges. They waited in prepared positions, let their attackers enter kill zones, and destroyed them with concentrated fire. The battlefield and captured gear drove home a harsher truth. American material strength was far beyond what Japanese intelligence had imagined. Browning guns didn't jam or overheat beyond design. Maintenance and spare parts kept them reliable. Marines carried more ammunition per man than a Japanese squad. Their artillery support outmatched anything the Japanese could summon. And the tight integration of infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire formed a system of destruction the Japanese had never faced. Within days of the Tenaru defeat, more Japanese troops were already bound for Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a major naval push to back the next attempt on Henderson Field. 3 slow transports left Truk on August 16th, with the remaining 1,400 men from Ichiki's regiment plus 500 naval Marines. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons left 1 transport badly damaged, Tokyo abandoned slow transports entirely and shifted to destroyer Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, destroyers and light cruisers put nearly 5,000 men from Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade ashore at Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express was brilliant at moving people. Destroyers could run to Guadalcanal and back in a single night, minimizing exposure to Henderson's planes, but it had a fatal flaw. Heavy gear couldn't come along. Artillery, tanks, trucks, and even adequate food and ammunition were left behind. That logistical reality doomed every Japanese push on the island. Men arrived with only what they could carry, living on what they could forage and what little could be snuck through American lines. Over time, they would fight the Americans and starvation at the same time. General Kawaguchi set September 12th for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for 3 thrusts, one along the western coast, a second from the south, through thick jungle, toward what Japanese scouts believed was a weak spot, and Kawaguchi's main effort down an inland ridge overlooking the airfield. What he didn't know was that Marine intelligence had already picked that ridge as the most likely avenue. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, had struck Tasimboco village on September 8th and found huge supply caches, proof a large enemy force was assembling. Edson read the plan at once. They would come from the south along the ridge. He asked to fortify it, and Vandegrift agreed. On September 10th, 11, Edson placed about 840 Marines, his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, on the ridge, choosing positions with the same methodical care seen at the Tenaru. Machine guns were sighted for interlocking fire. Mortar crews registered likely approaches. The 11th Marines plotted defensive fires. Every advantage of terrain and ordnance was calculated. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, roughly 1,000 meters long, with 3 knobs of ground, covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep, wooded ravines flanked both sides, perfect for night infiltration, and, if defended well, a perfect killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's attack began. Unlike Ichiki's simple charge, this one was more sophisticated. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both flanks, probing for weak spots and massing where they found them. The fighting was savage and confused. In the dark, Marines grappled at grenade-throwing distance with enemy soldiers who had wriggled close. But the defenses held. When larger groups formed to punch through, Marine mortars and artillery smashed them. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds that night, landing shells so near friendly lines that shrapnel wounded Marines. Machine gun teams fired until barrels glowed. Individual Marines used rifles, pistols, knives, and entrenching tools. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tenaru, moved along the line, urging men on and pointing out infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a critical gun position. When his crews were killed or wounded, he kept the gun firing alone, beating back wave after wave. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for that night. 2 Marines earned Medals of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 received the Navy Cross. At dawn on September 30th, the Japanese had failed to break through, but Kawaguchi still had men and prepared to try again. Edson pulled back to the center of the ridge to tighten his defense. Vandegrift sent reinforcements, raising the garrison to about 2,500. The next night's fighting was even fiercer. Kawaguchi threw everything he had into desperate attacks before the Marines could make the ridge unassailable. Japanese troops charged again and again and died by the hundreds in machine gun fire. Some reached within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, Edson grabbed a rifle and joined the line himself. Once more, American firepower and preparation carried the night. By dawn on September 14th, the offensive had collapsed. Between roughly 830 and 850 Japanese lay dead around the ridge. Marine losses were about 104 killed and over 200 wounded among the raiders and parachutists. Bloody Ridge, or Edson's Ridge, became a symbol of American defensive doctrine at its best. For surviving Japanese troops, it was another shattering of expectations. Captured diaries and later recollections tell the same story. They expected night infantry fights where spirit and skill would win. Instead, they met mortars, artillery, and machine guns massed and directed with a precision they could not match. U.S. commanders knew they were coming, built kill zones, let them enter, and then annihilated them with layered fire. Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set a pattern for the rest of the campaign. The Japanese would attack with courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. The Americans would answer with heavy firepower, combined arms coordination, and carefully prepared lines built to emphasize their strengths. The result was predictable: catastrophic Japanese losses and American casualties that were painful but sustainable. Yet numbers alone cannot convey Guadalcanal's misery. The environment itself killed impartially. Malaria struck nearly every man who stayed long. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division reported more than 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases sidelined around 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was universal. Fungal infections ate skin. Jungle rot opened sores that would not heal. Untreated dental problems became infections. The Japanese suffered even more. From the start, their supply situation meant too little food. The Tokyo Express could rarely bring enough. Men lived on what they could scavenge, stretching occasional rice deliveries to the breaking point. Starvation set in. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine ran out and never returned in adequate amounts. Minor wounds turned fatal. Later captured documents describe horror. By late October, over 60% of the 17th Army on the island was down with disease or malnutrition. Combat strength had fallen to maybe 30% of authorized numbers. 50 men a day were dying, mostly from hunger and sickness rather than bullets. Meanwhile, U.S. supply ships, protected by Henderson's aircraft in daylight, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medicine, and replacements. There were shortfalls, especially in August and early September after naval defeats, but they passed. By October, the pipeline was steady. Marines ate canned rations that weren't tasty but kept them going. Ammunition was abundant enough that gun crews could shoot out barrels and get new ones. Medical care included field hospitals, plasma, sulfa drugs, and evacuation of serious cases to rear areas. Japanese logistics consisted of what could be lashed to a destroyer deck or smuggled through U.S. lines. Soldiers learned to make one rice ball last a day. Ammunition was rationed so hard that orders often limited firing to the absolute minimum. Medical care meant a bandage if lucky, amputation without anesthesia if not, or death if infection set in. The gravely wounded were often handed grenades and left behind to kill themselves rather than slow their units or risk capture. In late October, Japan tried its largest push of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to lead it, bringing parts of the 2nd Division with China experience. The plan called for a coordinated, multi-directional assault, with the main strike from the south through jungle, much like the route to Bloody Ridge, but this time with more men, better coordination, and artillery finally hauled in by destroyers. The attack began on October 23rd with a Western probe. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal, rolled across the Matanecao River. U.S. defenders, including the newly arrived 164th Infantry of the American Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart knocked out all 9 quickly. The attack collapsed. The main blow came the night of October 24th, 25. About 5,600 troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, aiming to break through just below Henderson Field. They hit Han 7 Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th. The fighting became legendary. Attacks crashed in all night. Local penetrations were sealed with instant counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles. The 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, rounds landing within yards of Marine foxholes. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood ready to add naval gunfire if needed. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese and the airfield. But they held. Sergeant John Basilone, the hero of Bloody Ridge, again proved decisive. He hauled ammunition through fire to keep his guns alive, fixed weapons under fire, and when a position was overrun, drew his .45 and led a counterattack to seal the gap. By dawn on the 25th, the offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, cut down by machine gun fire during one assault. Over 2,000 Japanese lay dead. American losses were several hundred, heavy but bearable. October and November also brought naval battles that shifted control of the seas. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, November 12 to 15, produced some of the fiercest surface combat ever. In a chaotic night fight on November 13th, U.S. cruisers and destroyers met a Japanese bombardment force, including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, the only U.S. flag officers killed in WW surface actions, died that night. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. 3 more destroyers were damaged. But the Japanese lost Hiei, crippled overnight and sunk by aircraft the next day, and, crucially, failed to shell Henderson. The airfield kept operating. On the night of November 14-15, Kirishima tried again, but USS Washington and USS South Dakota intercepted. In a devastating display of radar-directed gunnery, Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese spotters could barely see. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most importantly, U.S. aircraft and ships wrecked a Japanese convoy carrying the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transports, only 4 reached the island, and planes and artillery destroyed even those before they could unload. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers were lost with the convoy. That was Tokyo's last serious attempt to land a large, properly equipped ground force. For those already on Guadalcanal, November marked the beginning of the end. Reinforcements and resupply had failed. Rations were cut again. Men who were already starving were told to live on even less. Medicine ran out entirely. Makeshift hospitals filled with the sick and wounded, where doctors could only watch men die. Japanese diaries from this period describe the downward spiral. Rice cut to a single ball per day, disease everywhere, bodies burned when there was strength enough to do it. No more ships coming, men eating grass and bark, poisonings, soldiers fading into starved shadows. In December, Tokyo quietly chose evacuation. Publicly, they would not admit defeat, but privately, they recognized that staying meant the destruction of the 17th Army. About 11,000 Japanese remained on the island, down from a peak of 36,000. Of those, maybe 7,000 could still walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or too weak even to crawl. The evacuation, Operation KE, was one of Japan's most successful efforts of the war. Using destroyers much like the Tokyo Express, they pulled out 10,632 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable feat under pressure, but it could not hide the scale of the defeat. Japanese presence on Guadalcanal peaked around 36,000. Of these, roughly 25,000, 30,000 died, about 14 to 800 in combat, and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American losses were serious but replaceable. Marines and soldiers suffered about 1,600 killed, 4,200 wounded, and thousands more sidelined temporarily by illness. U.S. industry and manpower made up the difference. New divisions were training. Ships and planes rolled off lines faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had shifted for good. Guadalcanal's impact on Japanese military thought was profound. For the first time, their forces were beaten in a sustained land campaign. Every offensive failed. Traditional tactics led only to mass casualties. The realization that American troops were not just well-equipped, but also well-led, tactically competent, and capable of enduring hellish conditions shattered pre-war beliefs. Survivors who wrote memoirs or gave interviews after the war stressed the same themes. They had underestimated American fighting qualities. The gap in gear and supplies was far larger than expected. Japanese logistics were unequal to a war against an enemy controlling sea and air, and spirit and skill could not overcome systematic deficits in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from veterans were consistent. They had believed themselves the superior warriors, harder training, readier for death, masters of night and close combat. On Guadalcanal, they learned that wars are won by systems. The Americans had systems for everything: supply, medicine, artillery, air-ground control, and those systems worked. Japanese systems failed because they had never been built to the same standard. Those who survived and later spoke contradicted official excuses. They admitted Americans defended brilliantly at night from prepared positions, endured malaria and rot while remaining combat effective because logistics backed them, and brought overwhelming, precise firepower. A single American battalion could deliver more effective fire than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical edges mattered. Japanese infantry carried Arisaka bolt-action rifles, hand-cycling each shot. Marines started with M1903 Springfields, also bolt-action, but more and more men received M1 Garands. The Garand's 8-round clip and semi-auto cycling gave an edge in firefights. Machine guns showed an even sharper contrast. The U.S. M1970A1, water-cooled, could fire continuously so long as it had water and ammo. Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 guns were lighter and easier to move, but could not sustain fire the same way. In defense, that difference was decisive. Artillery superiority may have mattered most. The 11th Marines fielded M1A1 pack howitzers, 75mm pieces that broke down for jungle transport and delivered responsive, accurate support. Forward observers brought fire in minutes. Japanese artillery was limited, hard to move, and short of shells. Naval gunfire added a dimension Tokyo could not answer. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could pound positions or support Marines with precision, guided by radio. Air power grew steadily more dominant. The Cactus Air Force, flying from Henderson under awful conditions, gained the upper hand over the island. Marine and Army pilots in F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted bombers. SBD Dauntlesses hit positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air from Rabaul flew at extreme range and had little time over target. The final U.S. ground push in January 1943 showed how far the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 12th Corps, Marines and Army together, launched coordinated attacks that carved up the remaining Japanese lines with massive artillery, air, and naval support. Starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages sapped Japanese resistance. On February 9, 1943, American patrols found the enemy gone. General Patch radioed Admiral Halsey his famous line, "Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal." The campaign was done. 6 months of fighting, brought America its first major ground victory over Japan. More than that, Guadalcanal revealed patterns that would define the Pacific War. The lessons for Japan were brutal. The myth of the invincible warrior was broken. Individual bravery and tactical skill could not cover systemic shortfalls. Night attacks and close combat, so successful in China, failed against dug-in American positions. Logistics wasn't a side issue, it was the foundation. Air and sea control decided land battles. Some officers grasped the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited the island, later wrote that Japan needed a complete strategic rethink. The Americans were fighting an industrial war where output decides outcomes. Japan could not outproduce the United States. But a military culture built on tradition and recent triumphs struggled to accept reforms that deep. Official explanations blamed supplies, naval defeats, and stronger-than-expected U.S. defenses. They didn't admit the core problem, doctrine itself. The approach that worked against China failed against a modern industrial opponent. Those who survived Guadalcanal and later were captured or returned home became witnesses to a transformation they had never imagined. They came as confident warriors from an empire that felt unstoppable. They left as starved, diseased survivors of a catastrophe. Many later said Guadalcanal was when they first knew Japan would lose. Their testimonies captured the psychological turn. The Americans were not weak. They were overwhelmingly strong, not only in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and staying power. Japanese troops fought with courage and skill. It wasn't enough. Americans fought with systems and resources Japan could not match. On the U.S. side, the takeaways were different, but just as important. Marines and soldiers learned they could meet Japanese troops head-on in the jungle. The aura of Japanese invincibility evaporated. U.S. defensive doctrine worked. Combined arms worked. Properly trained and equipped, Americans could defeat Japanese forces. At the same time, they gained respect for a relentless enemy who would die rather than surrender. The chasm between approaches to surrender and prisoner welfare showed deep cultural differences. Americans tried to encourage surrender. Leaflets, broadcasts, offers of food and treatment, but with little success. Out of roughly 36,000 Japanese on the island, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to fight. Strategically, Guadalcanal mattered far beyond its shores. Japan's failure to retake Henderson and the eventual evacuation proved their perimeter could be pierced. Allied strategy shifted from defense to offense. Industrial and material advantages could be turned into victory if applied methodically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the start of the slide. Losses of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced anywhere near U.S. rates. The decision to evacuate, though cloaked, acknowledged that Japan could not win a war of attrition against American industry. Veterans on both sides carried the island with them. U.S. Marines and soldiers who survived became teachers for new units, passing on hard-won lessons in jungle fighting, defense, and combined arms. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off the island in December, needed months to recover before returning to combat. Japanese survivors faced worse. Those lifted out by Operation KE were scattered across the Pacific, bearing the weight of defeat and the knowledge that American forces were far tougher than pre-war propaganda allowed. Many died in later battles as Japan's position eroded. Guadalcanal itself kept its scars for decades. wrecked airplanes, ruined vehicles, abandoned gear, and unexploded ordnance in the jungle and along the beaches. Henderson Field, expanded during and after the campaign, became a major Allied base for the Solomons. For historians and military professionals, Guadalcanal became a case study in amphibious warfare, jungle operations, logistics, air-ground cooperation, and blended naval and land power. Modern war requires more than brave soldiers and clever tactics. It demands industrial capacity, sound logistics, superior technology, and the stamina to fight for months on end. The human cost on and around Guadalcanal was immense. Over 7,000 Americans and Japanese died in the naval battles nearby. On land, American casualties topped 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered diseases whose effects lasted a lifetime. Yet in military terms, the stakes justified the cost. Guadalcanal was the turning point where the Allies shifted onto the offensive in the Pacific, proved Japan could be beaten in ground combat, and locked in patterns of air and sea superiority that would persist through the war. Ultimately, the story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is the story of two incompatible visions of modern war colliding. One side believed warrior spirit could overcome material gaps and that bold tactics would deliver victory regardless of resources. The other believed in the systematic application of industrial power, logistics, and firepower as multipliers, combined arms as the key to success. The jungle became the crucible where those beliefs were tested. After 6 months of brutal fighting, the outcome showed that concentrated fire support and robust supply, wedded to competent tactics and determined troops, produce a kind of power Japanese forces could not match. For the Japanese who survived to tell it, Guadalcanal was when illusion gave way to reality. Their training rested on false premises, their tactics were built for a different war, their logistics were inadequate from the start, and their nation had embarked on a conflict it could not win by military means alone. Americans learned other truths. They discovered they could go toe-to-toe with Japanese soldiers in savage combat. They proved industrial strength could be turned into battlefield victory. They refined jungle tactics and doctrine for the campaigns ahead, and they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a clear view of a formidable yet beatable foe. In the end, Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were not terrified by Americans as individual fighters, though those fighters proved formidable, but by the relentless, organized, overwhelming use of firepower and material the Americans brought every time. The fear was not of death. Japanese soldiers had been taught to accept that, but of the realization that courage and sacrifice no longer decided outcomes when the enemy never ran out of shells, treated his wounded, kept artillery firing, controlled the air, and could replace losses faster than combat could create them. The shift that began when Japanese units first ran into American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental turn in the Pacific War. From then on, Japan fought on the back foot against an enemy whose material edge grew month by month. Jungle fighting on Guadalcanal became the template for what followed, proving that U.S. forces could fight and win in the worst terrain against a ruthless opponent, so long as they had solid logistics, tight coordination, and overwhelming fire.